All right, I'm Ayman Mohyeddin at MSNBC World Headquarters in New York. President Trump has spent the last 24 hours on the world stage, but this afternoon could mark a critical turning point in the uncovering of the president's foreign policy. Right now, this hour, he's speaking with French President François Hollande, an ally who's been critical of President Trump, as has been German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who the president spoke with this morning. On Friday, both Hollande and Merkel called on the EU to unite against Trump over trade, his pro-Brexit views, and his commitment to NATO. They also stressed finding common ground between the countries. Sandwiched in between those phone calls today, the president's first discussion as president with Vladimir Putin. Joining me now from Paris is Christopher Dickey, MSNBC contributor and world news editor at The Daily Beast. Christopher, great to have you with us. Merkel, Hollande together in Berlin Friday, speaking out at a press conference against President Trump, in a sense representing the EU, just as Theresa May, the UK Prime Minister, was meeting with Trump in Washington. So it seems, at least from afar, a geopolitical chessboard of sorts. What's your big takeaway from the past 24 hours?
Well, I think that the biggest concern is about NATO. There'll be issues over trade. There'll be issues over Brexit. Obviously, Theresa May is taking one position, and Merkel and Hollande are taking another. But NATO is a question that they're all united on. They don't want to see the credibility of NATO undermined. They understand perfectly well that if you have a situation where Donald Trump is saying, maybe we'll support NATO, maybe we won't, maybe we'll support the Baltic states if Russia screws around with them, maybe we won't. All that is completely unacceptable to Europe, and all of these European leaders, including Theresa May from Britain, are pushing back against that.
Let me ask you about this, Chris. Obviously, the biggest decision here in the U.S. the past 24 hours has been that ban on refugees and others coming into the U.S. How is all of that playing out in the European Union, in France, in countries like Germany, where some have been sympathetic to the refugees, or at least the chancellor has been, but has also been taking heat for accepting so many refugees?
Well, you know, look, the refugee issue is a lot more complicated here in Europe than it is in the United States, because there are so many refugees here and there are really so few in the United States. I mean, I think truly this whole thing with the way Trump is addressing the world, where he acts as if everything he does is starting from square one, is something that the Europeans really don't understand. So, for instance, on the refugee question and the terror question, he's acting as if nothing was ever done about terrorism by the United States until he came into office. And now he's going to address terrorism by banning all these Muslims from all these countries for some determined or indeterminate amount of time. Everybody who deals with terrorism in Europe understands perfectly well that this plays right into the hands of the so-called Islamic State and of radicals around the Muslim world, because this is a fulfillment of their prophecies. This is exactly what they said would happen. This also, even the pitting of Christians against Muslims in the rhetoric of Donald Trump plays exactly into the rhetoric of Al-Qaeda and the so-called Islamic State. Chris, all of this Allah is answering their prayers when they hear this from Donald Trump.
Let me tap into
everybody who fights against terrorism in Europe understands that perfectly well. And frankly, almost all the people who fight against terrorism in the United States, who are actually in the trenches, actually fighting against the Islamic State, they understand that too.
Let me tap into your expertise a little bit from 35,000 feet. Take the big picture approach. You had today President Trump get an endorsement about the building of his wall with Mexico from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who tweeted out saying it's a great idea. He did it in Israel on the southern border between Egypt and Israel, prevented illegal immigration into that country, mostly of Africans. Is there a shifting of alliances here between the United States and the world? And how does that new alliance map look like if you have countries like France and Germany on one side, Israel and the United States talking about issues of building walls on the other side?
Well, if you go to Israel and you see the wall that runs through Jerusalem, you will have a very different opinion of the idea of building walls, because what you see is a divided country. What you see is people not only walling others out, but walling themselves in. That is exactly what Trump is proposing with the notion of a wall that he is putting forth on the Mexican frontier. Probably it won't be a wall at the end of the day. Probably he will give up on that promise like he'll give up on many other promises and then lie about it and say that he never made the promise in the first place, which we've often heard from him before. But if he builds that wall along the southern frontier, then what's going to happen? We're going to start to see problems on the Canadian frontier. You know, Canada has a very open immigration policy. If we're worried about Muslims, gosh, there are a lot of them going to Canada now. And in fact, Canada has been regarded by counter-terror forces for a long time as a potential security threat. Now, that's a very, very, very long border. Are we going to build a wall there, too?
Christopher,
I don't know, Mr. President.
Christopher Dickey,
you tell us.
Christopher Dickey, we can talk about this for hours. Unfortunately, though, they only gave me 60 minutes today, so we're going to have to leave it at that. World News Editor for the Daily Beast, Chris Dickey, always a pleasure to get your insights. We continue to monitor those protests outside of JFK Airport here in New York in the wake of President Trump's executive order that bans refugees and immigrants from 7 countries. We're going to have a lot more still ahead. Stay with us.